My name's David Worthington. I run the Open Innovation Labs practice in APAC for Red Hat. Today I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey of some transformation that I've seen in the relationship between business and IT in the last couple of years. And I'll really start with talking about a couple of questions. One that I was asked earlier this year and one that I have for you. First, just a little bit more about myself. I come from a business background. I've spent the last 9 years working on Agile transformation and delivery programs, both onshore and offshore, throughout Australia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and North and South America, including in China, India and Brazil for offshore, and then onshore delivery as well. And the first question in my presentation today was from a banker in Jakarta earlier this year. And to me it catalysed a whole heap of stuff that had been happening in the projects that I'd been running over the last sort of 8 or 9 years. And it's something that I increasingly am asked by people who, despite the fact that their industry is being challenged by disruptors from all around the world, still don't believe that their industry needs to change as quickly as they do. But I'm going to come back to that question in a bit. First, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about Agile. And it was great that Saul from Deloitte this morning talked about Agile and talked about how Agile is really quite mainstream. And it's true, the Agile Manifesto was created by a group of guys 16 years ago. And that really brought together a heap of different practices that were becoming more common. And even though we say that Agile is mainstream, and when we show the adoption curve, we really say a lot of organisations that are joining Agile now are laggards or late adopters, although it doesn't feel like that to them. And for instance, I worked on the first Singapore government Agile project, and we think of Singapore as a very advanced society, and that was only in 2014. And at the time, they really felt that they were early adopters. So although Agile is mainstream, it's still patchy in different regions around the world. And the advantage of that, I guess, is when you're talking to organisations about Agile is that a lot of the concerns that they have from a governance, auditability, compliance perspective that they feel that they're confronting for the first time has all been done by other people. And so that's one advantage. If we look at the reasons that organisations do Agile, and the reason I want to highlight this is because I think that we've been kidding ourselves for a while about some of the value that Agile on its own delivers. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a bit. But really increasing speed to value, so that's trying to deliver something as fast as possible. Improving business agility by being able to respond more quickly. And we think of startups and small organisations as being able to respond quickly, and large organisations need to be able to do that as well. Reducing governance and overhead in governance. And this is something that I always find quite amusing when you start talking to somebody about Agile, is that they say, well, there's no documentation, there's no control. The reality is there are more control points in an Agile project and adequate documentation. Obviously from the manifesto, we value working software over documentation, but I'm talking about the documentation that we need for auditability and controls. And Agile puts more control points in place, I would argue. And reducing risk. So as a project manager, I see myself as a risk manager primarily, and that's pulling risk as far forward as possible. So in Agile, we do the riskiest piece of work first, or we spike the riskiest technology piece first. And making sure that we build the right things and build them the right way. And I'm going to come back to this slide in a moment. So we're all familiar with what was happening before Agile, and we've got our product owner here, and product owners are always rock stars all of the time. So that's why she's there. And then, we had this, we had this divide between sort of business and technology. The business analysts might have been on the business side, but quite often they were from the technical side. And what I found was that even business analysts that came from the business side lost touch with the business quite quickly if you isolated them. And so I've put them there on the technology side. And then, of course, you've got your developers and your testers and the ops people sitting there. And typically what we'd do is we'd write requirement documents for months or years, throw them over the wall. And as Saul said this morning, 3 years later, we find out that we've built the wrong thing, or we've got a defect, or something that we need to go back and fix again. And so what I saw, the first part of a transformation that was happening in Agile, in IT, was IT moving a little bit closer to the business, or at least parts of IT moving closer to the business. And so we had the developers and the business analysts and the testers moving from the IT side closer and closer to the business. And this wasn't an easy thing. This required a lot of change. And a lot of organisations, again, going back to Agile is mainstream, a lot of organisations are doing, Agile or waterfall with a veneer of Agile. So they've still got the same governance processes in place, or they're still expecting end-of-month reports that are 6 weeks out of date before they get looked at. And so that requires the cultural change and the organisational change within the organisation. And so we had the developers and the testers sitting next to the product owner and the business analyst when stories are being kicked off, because that story was going to be ready to showcase tomorrow or next week. So we didn't have this feedback cycle anymore of months or years. We had feedback cycles that were reduced down to days or weeks. And that was important that first change happened, because I think it started to highlight to organisations the change that was needed within that organisation. But there was still a gap in the value chain. And by that, I mean, if we look at, this is a typical sort of basic Kanban wall, okay? So we're doing the right things here. We've got stories broken down into small parts. So a story is a thin slice of business value. We've got a simple Kanban board up there with ready, in dev, in QA, and done. And so the business value or the pieces of work are moving across that Kanban board. And we've even got, say, a defect and a tech task in there as well. So we've got a nice orderly flow of work. But the challenge was that we were getting work to a point that we call done in Agile, which means that we were ready to showcase the work. So, we were doing all the right practices, daily stand-ups, weekly retrospectives, looking at improving the way that we do our work, weekly demonstrations of working software. But the problem is that the work was done, but it's not what in Agile we call done. And it's only done when it's in production. So what was happening was this work was building up, okay? And we'd have these long release cycles where we were dependent on the IT department and the ops, the people that were left behind when the developers and the testers came across. So we had this backlog of work that might sit there for 1 month, 3 months, or 6 months, depending on when IT were able to go to production. And so, although we were getting feedback from customers, we could demonstrate working software every week, get that feedback incorporated into the backlog, and some of that feedback would go straight through and be showcased the following week. So we had those short feedback cycles, but we weren't getting the full value of what Agile really promised. And so I think if we go back to the reasons we do Agile, I see that as a lost opportunity, right? Because we were having speed to value in that we could demonstrate the working software, but we weren't having speed to market because we weren't going into production and releasing it to our customers. And we could get customer feedback, but it's different looking at a prototype or looking at something in a test environment than actually putting it out into the marketplace and testing it. And so the first wave of IT moving closer to the business was Agile, and I see Devops as the second wave of IT moving closer to the business. So now we've got the ops department are sitting in the same kickoff meetings with the product owners and the developers and the testers and the business analysts, because the story that they're working on today can be in production tomorrow, and ops need to know what's happening into production. So that was really the second wave of that, the IT moving from the left to the right. And so let's go back to that question that I was asked by this senior banker in Jakarta back in April. And this was an all-day workshop that we were running around Agile, enterprise agility, and Devops. And we'd spent the morning talking about those topics and explaining that the advantage of Devops was that you were taking the decision from when to go into production from IT and moving it to the business. And so we said, okay, this gives you the ability to go to production every day. And this very senior banker put his hand up and said, but why would I want to go to production every day? And it was a good question, and we get asked this question a lot. As I said earlier, a lot of companies don't believe that their industry changes fast enough to need to go to production every day. And so there were really two things that I explained. One was I gave an example, which was I asked the room, and there were 30 business and IT people, majority business people, senior people, and I said, have you got an online application form for your credit cards, for example? And they said yes. And I said, okay, so if I could look at the user experience data that we're getting from that online form, okay, we could probably find that there's a point at which a percentage of your potential customers are dropping out of the application process. So let's say we looked at the online behaviour of the customers, and we found that at question 8, 25% of potential customers were dropping out, and we didn't know why. Okay, so those 25% are gone, and we may never see them again. So let's sit with the product owner, with the business analyst, with the designer, and let's rewrite that question. Okay, we can do that in the morning, and we rewrite that question, and then we sit with the ops people and the developers and the testers, and they write that story that afternoon, and it's ready to be pushed from the developer's laptop into production. And the next day, we do some A/B testing where we expose alternate customers, one to the old question, one to the new question. And we do that test for the whole day, and at the end of the day, if the percentage of customers who have dropped out at question 8 has dropped below 25%, then we leave that question up and we take the old form down. And suddenly there was a transformation in the room. There was a real aha moment, okay? And you could see the business people going, wow, okay? And so that was the first point, was that explanation. The second point was, just because you've got the ability to go to production every day doesn't mean you have to, right? What we're trying to do is empower the business to have the ability to go to production when they're ready. And the other interesting thing that happened a little bit before that was I was presenting to the CEO of a large bank in Singapore, and we were talking also about Devops. And we talked about how you can go safely from a developer's laptop to a pre-production environment and then into production. And of course, he was absolutely horrified at the thought that some young kid wearing a hoodie is going to be pushing stuff directly from his laptop into production. And so I think the important thing there is to talk about the safety and the processes that we can put in place to ensure that the production environment is still safe. So we've got SonarQube or Fortify to make sure that there's quality and that there's security built into the system. And once we demonstrated that took a lot of that issue away as well. So I think the key message then was we've got the opportunity to push to production every day if we want to. We've moved the decision-making process from the IT department, who we're still relying on for the safe environment, moving it to the business and empowering the business to make those decisions. And so that really leads to the second question in today's presentation, which is, are you ready for when your line of business comes to you with this request? Because that was the real aha moment in that room, where you've got 5 IT people and 25 business people probably having slightly different reactions to the thought of, I'm about to be asked to go into production every day. And so at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, what we do is work with organisations to help them answer that question. And what I'm going to talk about now is really 3 use cases that we typically find when we're talking to organisations about their DevOps readiness and their opportunities for an Open Innovation Lab. The first use case is around disruptive innovation. And we think about disruptive innovation, we often think about small startup companies who are able to be very nimble and move around quicker than their larger competitors. But that's not always the case. Often there's large organisations who want to set up an innovation lab or a disruption centre within their organisation. And so through a open innovation lab, we can help co-create innovative and disruptive products that can be tested in the marketplace as quickly as possible. The idea is to move from concept to cash as fast as you can. And a great example of this is an organisation called Easy ER, which was a couple of doctors from Sweden who ran an emergency department who had had an idea for an app for many years but had not been able to catalyse that app. And what they wanted to do was build an app that allowed patients, as they were coming into the emergency department or their carers, to enter customer data and symptoms, and then allow nursing staff in the emergency department to triage the flow of patients and try and streamline the flow of patients into and through the emergency department. And after just 5 weeks in an innovation lab, they had 2 production-ready apps. One that allowed patients or their carers to enter data, and the other that allowed nursing staff to triage the flow of those patients through the emergency department. And those 2 apps are now being used in emergency departments in hospitals around the world. The second use case is probably one that is familiar to anybody who's worked in a large bank, insurance department, government department, anywhere around the world. And that's where the organisation understands that it needs to change, and perhaps has been using Devops or Agile or microservices, but is struggling within the confines of the large organisation to get that catalyst for change. And so you think of this large container ship floating down the middle of a river, and knowing that it's got to change direction, but it needs that little catalyst that help to change. And we can do that through the Open Innovation Labs residency. And an example of this is a large health organisation in North America who for the first time in their history was about to enter into a competitive funding situation. So they'd been told that the $10 to $50 million a year funding that they get was about to dry up if they didn't demonstrate a new way of working. And so through I think it was an 8-week innovation lab in North America, they were able to demonstrate a new way of working for the rest of the organisation. And they could bring senior stakeholders and sponsors in and demonstrate this new way of working, demonstrate working software every week, demonstrate the ability to push from a developer's laptop to a pre-production environment. And through that exercise, they managed to secure additional funding going forward. And the third use case is really what I think is probably one of the most interesting ones, and that's the opportunity to explore state-of-the-art practices and products. So if you imagine going to a car yard on a Saturday morning, and for many people buying a car is probably the second largest purchase that they'll make in their life. I'm from Singapore, and up there it's almost the largest thing you make with their licence fees. But you sit there next to the salesperson, you drive around the block, maybe you get to third gear, and then you park the car and you're expected to make a decision on purchasing that car. Right? Compare that to the ability to have that car for 2 months and really test that car to its fullest extent. And that's what we offer through a road trip with the Innovation Labs, where we give you the opportunity to be exposed to all of the Red Hat emerging products, but not only Red Hat products, also best-of-breed open source and commercial products. So for example, in the lab, if we're using collaboration tools, we might use Slack or Jira, as well as using the Red Hat emerging products. So it gives your team the opportunity to be exposed to the full extent of those products, and also be exposed to the full extent of modern application development practices. The lab's an immersive residency, 4 to 12 weeks, and so you get to experience the Agile cycle, the weekly cycle of doing the best practices over and over, and also get exposed to using those tools. Now, many organisations can see themselves in at least one or two of those. A lot of the large organisations we talk to are really sitting in the transformation and the road trip. They realise they need to change and they need that catalyst to change, but they also want to be exposed to all of the emerging products without having to make that commitment to buy subscriptions. And a really cool example of this is an organisation in the UK that provides modified cars and motorised wheelchairs to disabled people, and their point of pride is their 96% customer satisfaction. But they could see that they needed to change in order to maintain that flexibility that provided that high level of satisfaction. And they also wanted to expose their team to modern practices, but also emerging products. And over a 1-month lab in London, that gave them the opportunity, without having to make the commitment to move to that new technology, to experience firsthand. So just a quick overview of what the Innovation Labs practice itself is. It's really split into 3 parts. I think you've probably heard a number of times the discovery sessions have been mentioned. From a labs perspective, what the discovery session is focused on is working with a customer to understand the largest challenge or the largest opportunity that they face. And over the period of a half a day or a day, using a combination of Red Hat experts, working with senior business and technology people from the client, we'll go through with some facilitation techniques such as impact mapping and try and identify a key goal that we want to achieve and test through the lab. We'll then come up with a series of hypotheses that we can then test in the lab so that we are getting immediate feedback on those. We use Red Hat's push-button infrastructure, which allows us to spin up an environment to use for the lab using Red Hat emerging products, but also best-of-breed, open source and commercial. That allows us to be ready to start development on the first morning of the lab. The lab itself is, as I said, between 4 and 12 weeks. We will agree the duration and the goals in the discovery session. And we use that as an opportunity to do Agile, Scrum and Devops. Because we're working on a weekly cycle. As I said, we're doing daily stand-ups, weekly retrospectives, weekly demonstration of working software. So there's an opportunity for continuous feedback and continuous improvement within the lab. We also give you exposure to the Red Hat Learning subscriptions, which allows technical attendees of the lab to do pre-work to understand the basics of the emerging products, but also have that opportunity to use that subscription for the rest of the year to ensure that they're building on their skills. At the end of the lab, we'll do a retrospective where we'll look at what we've delivered so far through the lab and then build a roadmap for you to be able to continue that process going forward. The idea is to embed these practices into your organisation and allow you to continue that change as you're going forward.